Get Set Green Season 3. I'm your host Pooja Arvi, where we explore the systems, ideas, and global forces shaping a more sustainable future. In this episode, under the System Shapers theme, we take a closer look at the hidden geopolitics behind the clean energy transition and the growing importance of critical minerals in shaping the future of EVs, batteries, and renewable technologies. Joining us is Thomas Nadrowski, author of Mineral War, China's Quest for Weapons of Mineral Destruction, and portfolio manager at Amvest Terraden, Critical Minerals Fund. Through this conversation, we explore mineral security, supply chain dependencies, recycling, and global race to secure resources powering the energy transition. And welcome, Thomas.
Thank you, Pooja. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Happy to host you here because I see you have a lot of understanding in depths and various angle to it, because I come from an LCA background, so I see things from, let's say, what is the carbon emissions, what is the carbon footprint. I only look at from environmental perspective, and I was personally quite curious to understand from you how the geopolitics works around this and what is the supply demand looks like, right? I was more curious to understand these angles also. So, Thomas, could you help us understand where, let's say, if we have to ask a question, what or why are critical minerals becoming so important in the clean energy transition today?
So, this is really the fundamental question. And to start answering this, I'll just step back and explain a little bit what we're doing at our fund because it partly answers the question. We started in 2022 focusing on critical minerals, initially predominantly focused on the battery materials and other technologies, but also then spreading to specialty metals that serve various new technologies and also rare earths as a separate category, which of course have also their application. I'm sure we're going to talk about it a bit later. However, one of the differentiating elements in our strategy is to avoid the Chinese value chain with our investments. And our investments are upstream, essentially equity of companies that either mine, develop, or explore for these minerals, and sometimes refine or process and purify them. So we are very much upstream from usual applications. And really, the one of the triggers of the strategy as we geared up for this sort of in the early stages of COVID was a recognition that in the West, as the investment in gigafactories and batteries factories grew exponentially. And at some point in 22, we calculated almost $200 billion committed between North America, Europe, Asia, even outside of China. However, we didn't see anything commensurable in terms of the upstream investment of materials that would have to feed that capacity. And that exposed at least the western side of the divide to sort of quasi-monopolistic pressure from the Chinese side, which already for many years controlled many of these materials. How did that happen? Well, before running this fund, I was in a family office up in Connecticut here, and running a much broader mining portfolio. And around 2015, 2016, battery materials for the first time kind of like burgeoned on the screen saying, oh, this is this other category because, usually when you're a mining business for many years, you do always the same things. It's either precious metals or base metals or bauxite and iron and so on. And suddenly we have this lithium story, right? And so that's exciting. I looked at it and I found that it was not very positively correlated with the other materials, which is important if you run a portfolio and you want to reduce risk. So we started looking at lithium and cobalt and manganese and so on, mostly for batteries. And we invested and we held this sub portfolio for about 2 years. And then in late 2017, I was in Asia for some family issues, and I decided to sell this sub portfolio towards the end of 2017. And that was perfect timing because what happened in the next 2 years, the entire space just cratered. There was just zero interest from the investors in the last 2 years before COVID, 2018, 2019. And that meant that a lot of future prospective mines around the world, Latin America, Africa, and elsewhere, found themselves without capital. So there was suddenly no support for these projects, with one exception. There was one source of capital that was still in the market, the Chinese source of capital. And the Chinese companies, some of them state owned, some of them state directed, of state directed capital, just swooned through probably 50% of all the lithium assets that were available at that time, 2018, 2019. Then suddenly we have COVID and we have all these dislocations and so on. And then electrification really picks up with the Tesla theme and all of these gigafactories. And, where is the material coming from? Well, it was already very heavily controlled by China at that point, and if anything, this trend has accelerated since then. So that makes those material critical. Not only they are critical for because of the demand, obvious demand, whether it's batteries, whether it's wind power, whether it's solar, and so on. You just need them for just about everything. Secondarily, they are critical because of supply and possible supply restrictions, and especially now as this quasi-monopoly for not just mining, very often actually refining and processing in the middle of the value chain, controlled by China, is sometimes weaponized. And it's been weaponized over many years as many of these critical minerals have been restricted for exports in form of minerals or oxides or compounds, but also related technology to process them, or equipment to process that IP that China wants to now restrict within its borders. So it is a major issue for those jurisdictions that are still planning to advance. Europe is a great example of that. Europeans struggle to build attractive EVs, and they're easily underpriced by Chinese operators. So the European Union has erected some tariffs to protect their car making industry, but the Chinese companies come to then build factories in Europe, in Hungary for a long time now, in Spain as well. That level of exteriorization of Chinese capital doesn't come with any technology transfer. So the actual embedded value added stays in China, and essentially here in Mexico and US we call them maquiladora. So it's as if like a sort of like a makeup factories. So you just basically assemble something and you move on. And unfortunately, some of the Asian economies that are facing US trade restrictions against China are on the receiving end of the same process. Therefore, the Chinese components come into, say, Vietnam. Vietnam just assembles that, sends it to the United States as made in Vietnam, but most of the value added is generated in China, which is a huge problem for Vietnamese industries, as the local private companies cannot compete against this, and people just redeploy their capital into real estate with potentially disastrous long-term consequences for that economy. But in Europe, there is an intention to push back. They call it like investment accelerator, to force the sources of that green technology to be shared. So the technology to be shared with the, say, JV partners in Europe. In a way, flipping over the model of foreign investment in China for many years. When I worked there in the 1990s, everything had to be JV'd with the local partner, and you had to share technology. So now Europeans are trying to do the same with the Chinese and turn the table on them, given how advanced the Chinese are in many of these technologies that were not invented in China but have been perfected in China, and China is pushing back. The CCP decided that no, you're not allowed as a Chinese company to exteriorize or externalize sources of your research or and technology. So we have several bottlenecks in the whole value chain. One is access to
Supply chain.
one is access to
Yeah.
the critical minerals. Secondly is the capacity to process those, which is the main source of monopolization, and then the diffusion or lack of diffusion of the technologies, the most advanced technologies in this space.
Thank you so much, Thomas, explaining us, lucidly in terms of giving an overall overview of how things look like from a larger perspective. Could you help us understand, let's say, when you are saying about this three processes, right? Where do we access it, and how do we, let's say, the process it, the extraction, and also maybe processing it in certain grades of materials, and then where it will go into the manufacturing. Let's focus, narrow down on this processing part, right? Do we have technologies available, let's say, in terms of only with China or other Asian countries, or who are the ones who are leading the technologies in processing these critical minerals?
So that depends on the mineral. We call them minerals. They're actually chemical elements, as we know, right? So
Yeah, yeah.
the common English language just sort of distorted what we learned at school. Minerals are those, amalgamates in the ground from which different elements are pulled, but we call them
Mm-hmm.
critical minerals for some reason instead of critical elements, which they are. So depending on the chemical element, that level of monopolization differs. I think on the battery side, the one that's more critically controlled almost entirely by China and has been the source of leverage is
Mm-hmm.
graphite on the anode side. So
Okay.
the active anode materials that go into lithium ion batteries because of just one process. So with graphite, you have to do a couple of things. You have synthetic and you have natural graphite. Natural flake graphite is mined. Sort of there's initial processing, but before it gets coated to become that active anode material, it has to be spheronized. So in a sort of it become little balls. For some reason, China has been controlling that processing node of spheronization for a long time, which allows them to essentially control the entire supply chain of natural
Mm-hmm.
graphite to 98, 99%. And what surprises me really about the outside world that deals with this, from India to Korea to Japan to Europe and US, is that we've known it for a long time. We in October 23, so almost 3 years ago, China slapped restrictions on exports of graphite. So if you were, say,
Mm-hmm.
a Hungarian government that's very friendly with China, then those Chinese factories, maquiladoras, in Hungary will receive that graphite, but others don't, right? So just to process Chinese cars built in Europe, but nobody else will get it. For 3 years, Western companies have failed to rebuild that capacity to spheronize it and become more independent of the Chinese value chain. Now there's a first movement, and it comes from POSCO, the Korean company, that's finally advancing its first facility. But you have to question why. Why are we waiting for so long? And of course, one of the reasons is that, of course, downstream producers, downstream car makers, are so dependent on that and on its cheap graphite from China that for them procurement is cost center. So they would rather keep the low prices, hoping that nothing else happens. But as we know, geopolitically, so many things are happening these days that it's inevitable that we have frictions here. And U.S. set up some tariffs. The downstream industry is pushing back. No, no, no. We do need the Chinese graphite, and it's a constant quid pro quo depending who's politically stronger, rather than designing a viable system going forward. Now, on the other minerals, that also depends because there are two different things, as you mentioned, right? Extraction may happen in very exotic jurisdictions around the world, and then processing, which usually does not happen there. Just some pre-processing may happen not far away from the mining operation, but not the main sort of big industrial hubs that often need co-localization of different nodes. Just for the case of graphite, usually your graphite processing factory needs a steel plant next door to use some byproducts, some graphite fines for EF furnaces, but it also requires a chemical plant that's close to produce hydrofluoric acid, which is extremely toxic and difficult to transport at a distance. So you need a major industrial compound all around that graphite plant, and China has it, and I don't know, 60 cities have a steel plant, right? But other countries don't. And if you build a graphite mine in Tanzania, you're not going to rebuild this entire value chain. So it has to be built somewhere else. And so, but the question is, so how is this that China is so dominant, even if many of these materials are mined overseas? And it's an entirely different package of questions related to the structure of the Chinese investments, say in Africa, which are vertically integrated. Once you vertically integrate it, so from the state-owned bank through a state-owned off-taker, so some kind of refinery in the ground, and then you send a company that's dependent on that offtake and on that loan to Africa, you take away several sources of risk. So in mining, we have commodity risk, we have, of course, financing risk, we have cycle risk, we have jurisdictional risk, and many others. Working this way, China reduces this risk, and then you have the strong dependency of many of these governments in Africa on Chinese loans historically. Now, of course, it's reversing because these loans have to be repaid, but historically, China plus 52 countries in Africa, because Eswatini recognizes Taiwan, but the others are consolidated in this FOCAC forum of Africa-China cooperation, in which China is trying to reduce the jurisdictional risk in many of these places for their own companies. And the second thing is that they come usually with infrastructure projects which are entirely unrelated to the mining operation, executed by a state-owned enterprise, and that's not a profit center, right? It's basically a state strategy to buy those African governments for access to these materials. So while China does not have at home big deposits of, say, cobalt or manganese, it has been able to nearly control almost entire cobalt production in the Congo, and much of the
Mhm.
manganese production in Gabon, and so on, and many other places, because of that structure, the very much a top-down structure. This doesn't say that China does not have very rich geology in its own way in the country, especially in the south, but probably less so for battery materials. I mean, there is lithium. It's a lithium of relatively low quality. A mineral is called lepidolite, and it's mined in Jiangxi province. Often not profitable in itself, but again, it's mined by a very large battery company called CATL, which can basically subsidize its mining operation, what standalone lithium companies around the world cannot do. There is graphite in the north, there is nickel in the north, but cobalt and manganese had to be sold out outside, and therefore those vertical pipelines were extremely helpful because they're designed to reduce the risk and cyclicality of these raw materials, whose prices, of course, as commodities, fluctuate over time, right? So China takes away that risk, and that allows them to be very dominant in some of those mining jurisdictions for specific materials, specific critical minerals, even though they are not necessarily present richly in the Chinese subsoil. So two different things, right? One is the mining, and the second is the refining and the processing that requires often this massive consolidation
Yeah,
of industrial power in one space.
correct. And what about Bolivia and Argentina, Kyle, right? They have like largest amount of resources available when it comes to lithium. So how does this play into this supply chain or value chain, Thomas?
So first, I would encourage anybody, if they have a chance, to go and visit that lithium triangle in Argentina, Peru, Bolivia, and
I
Chile.
have heard of it, but yeah, I have not visited it. Yeah.
It's a beautiful place. I mean, you're on 4,500 meters, so get ready for
Oh.
that. And you need dark glasses because it's white, it's salt plants, right? And it's
Mm-hmm.
blue skies, so it's pretty disorienting. But it's true. The largest resources are there, probably even the largest resources in Bolivia, which have remained untapped for two reasons. One is environmental, which is a serious issue. The second one is a little bit of a problem with processing this. It's magnesium heavy. The Chinese have similar deposits in occupied Tibet, but they have learned how to process that material. The problem with Bolivia is that the country spent, what, 2 decades under socialism, and Morales and Ares, and essentially killed its mining industry. Very much state owned, very much top down controlled, signing great deals with China, with Russia, sort of pontificating against the West and so on. All good, but nothing happened. Nothing happened there. Now the question is whether the new government will start rebuilding the economy after those last 2 decades and bringing real investors. It's too early to say. Right now, there is no problem of lithium deficiency yet in the market. So this may not be yet the main focus. Right now, it's focused for Bolivia, but not so much for investors as I see it around the world. Argentina and Chile are very different stories. Chile has had a very viable lithium mining uh, industry long before we heard about lithium. So for chemical industry, because historically companies that mined lithium, especially in those evaporitic, not hard rock deposits, like in the Andes, there were chemical companies, not mining companies. So this was part of sort of slightly different sector because of the use of that material. Argentina joined a couple of years ago, and what I referred to earlier, that sweep by the Chinese operators in 2018, 2019, happened largely in Argentina, partly also in Mexico without much success there. But in Argentina, yes, because the country kind of joined that lithium train a little later with a lot of juniors, Australian, Canadian juniors, going there, exploring successfully and developing these projects, and then finding themselves without capital backing, hence that turn towards the Chinese capital providers. Now, let's face it, that strategy that juniors had at that time out of, say, Argentina, uh, is not available anymore. So since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, both the Canadian and Australian regulators have tightened the screws for the sake of national security, and that affects even the companies listed or domiciled in Canada and Australia and operating somewhere else, such as South America. So there are not it's not that easy anymore to sell your project to the Chinese operators because of a broader sort of macro geopolitical picture that has changed radically since Putin's invasion in Ukraine.
So this brings to my next question, which is like, can the world really meet growing mineral demand while still staying sustainable?
Hmm. Yeah, the two different parts, right? So, what does it mean sustainable for mining? So, mining is never really sustainable because it's non-benign and it's finite, right? Every mine will eventually end. Now, I worked for a long time in a large mining company, a South African mining company, and what we were trying to do, because we realized that mining itself is a finite story, is to create an economic framework around this for local populations that would be sustainable, that would survive the mine in itself. And there's a lot of work, a lot of studies done on how to execute that in different cultural contexts. So the best mining companies know how to do this. Also, the other thing that happens is that you actually meet so much talent, so much sort of future talent in those jurisdictions that you know taking these people for the schools and teaching them technical stuff, and some of the best, sending them to universities around the world, has been the best source of human capital development. So that part I would call sustainable. When it comes to what's in the ground, it's a little different story. So depends on a number of issues. Depends on um, three things. We mentioned demand and supply, but there's also substitution risk. So imagine you're a mining investor and you see, okay, well, there is this great, say, nickel deposit there, and nickel is important for NMC batteries, right? For those cathodes materials. I'm going to now invest. This is 2019. I'm going to invest in nickel. Except that 5 years later, China doesn't use NMC batteries. They use LFP batteries that don't use any nickel. You have just plugged $300 million into an operation somewhere, but the structure of the demand changed because of the substitution risk. That's the unfortunate story. Your mining process is so long, from discovery, resource development, conversion to reserves, all these different studies you need to do for the initial capex to build the project, and then the ramp up, and then the commercial level steady
Yeah.
state production. 16 years for a nickel mine, right? So many
Yeah.
things can happen in the meantime. So you take this massive, massive risk. And so you're going to
Yeah.
have inevitably in certain minerals overproduction, in other minerals underproduction. Unfortunately, this underproduction is also related to the fact that this world is splitting at least into
Mm-hmm.
two, maybe more, but at least into two, the China and ex-China. And China is very rich in many of those critical minerals, and the West is not. And so the West needs to really catch up. Right now, at current technologies, there are some question marks, but I tell you what, the demand also depends on the availability of a given material. I give you a great example that most of us don't think about. The material, or the element, is called niobium. It's Nb on your table of elements. Niobium
Mm-hmm.
historically goes into certain steel alloys, and 10 years ago, Toshiba came up with a new battery model that used niobium instead of graphite for anode. So niobium titanite, right? So it's a compound based on niobium. The problem is that although it is a much better anode than graphite anode, is that there is just not enough niobium supply in the world. There are three mines, two of them in Brazil, one controlled by a Chinese entity, the other one controlled partly by Chinese, but also Korean, Japanese, and local Brazilian family, and the tiny, tiny mine in privately owned in Canada. That's not enough. Three mines in the world. It's not enough to rebuild the entire value chain of the global, say, EVs on the back of that Toshiba invention to use niobium in anodes. So niobium has retained its role as an alloy for steel, some super alloys, important maybe for quantum computing in future and so on, but nothing really of the size. And now there is a very important project in Australia, in Western Australia, potentially developing a massive niobium mine in future, and maybe some
Okay.
adjacent deposits around, which could
Mm-hmm.
completely transform the global picture, not only for niobium itself, but maybe even for anodes and therefore better materials and so on and so forth. So you have to maintain sort of a more long-term perspective for certain things, but at the end of the day, it
Mm-hmm.
depends on serendipity and the quality of geologists and the material that you find to develop that, and the capital market coming with you.